I see we're live. Welcome to our seventh international roundtable today, which is focusing on the climate crisis. And I'm very happy that I'm here. My name is Michelle. I am a member of the National Board of Jusos, which is the biggest socialist youth organization in Germany. And I'm very glad that I'm here with three incredible women. Firstly, there's Karin Nansen, who is the chair of Friends of the Earth International, which is the largest federation of environmental groups. And you are also the founder or one of the founders of Redes, which is the branch of it in Uruguay that was already founded in 1988. And then we have Brianna Chandler, who is a member of the Sunrise Movement. And you are also involved in the Black Lives Matter movement in your town. And then we have Amanda Gomez from the Eco-Socialist Caucus from Akbayan Youth from the Philippines. So I'm very happy that you're all here and join us tonight for this discussion. Our panel is called actually Our Future is Burning, a call for a global Green New Deal. And one of the reasons is basically that literally we see fires burning, like in Siberia right now, where like one of the coldest places or towns has like over 38 degrees right now. And we see other irrevocable changes, such as in the Amazon or the Great Barrier Reef and other places where there are just changes happening that we cannot revoke anymore in the future. But at the same time, we have like 2020 will be the hottest year ever, probably. And at the same time, there's a second fire, and I would say that it's our fire as activists, which is basically like the passion and compassion that we're seeing in the climate strikes that have been happening globally for the last few months or even the last year, with thousands of young people standing up for each other and saying that they want to basically have a say in their future and what happens to nature. And I would start with the first question, which is basically because we not only have the climate crisis, but right now we also are living, some of us are still living under lockdown because of COVID-19 and the pandemic. So my first question would be to you, in which way is your climate activism, has it been influenced by this pandemic in your country or in your region? And maybe we can start with Karin.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to share this panel with you and with the audience. From our perspective, it's so important that we understand that the climate crisis is a crisis that has to do with justice. Climate change is taking place now and here, and it's already killing millions of people around the world. It's destroying the livelihoods of peoples, and it's part of the systemic, interrelated social ecological crisis that our world is facing today. So we need to address the climate justice, the climate crisis from a justice perspective, and this is fundamental to us. So when we talk about climate justice and activism, we, of course, have seen that mobilizations are not really possible nowadays because of the pandemic and the crisis we are facing. But on the other side, we acknowledge that climate activism is not only about mobilizing on the streets, in the cities around the world, but it's also about the peoples who are resisting on the ground, all the detrimental projects, energy projects, mining, the expansion of agribusiness that is destroying their livelihoods, their territories, but it's also contributing to the climate crisis. So when communities are fighting against fossil fuel exploration and exploitation, mega dams, against the expansion of palm oil or other trees plantations or soybean, when communities are fighting against the expansion of mining in the Amazon what they are doing is really mobilizing for a climate justice, but not only to address the climate crisis, but also the other interrelated systemic crises we face that have to do with a system that perpetrates the accumulation of capital and perpetrates exploitation of human beings and nature. So climate activism is still taking place. People are fighting on the ground, and this is what makes possible to change the energy system, for example, or the food system, is because communities are mobilizing on the ground to make sure that they can have control over their own food system, energy system, and find ways to do it in a sustainable and fair way.
Yeah, maybe we can move on with, thank you for your comments. And I would totally agree that climate justice is social justice at the same time. And maybe with Brianna, who is in the US currently, and you not only you also have an election coming up. So that's a particular situation that you're finding yourselves in. And I mean, the Sunrise Movement, most of us, I think, know it from the sit-ins that we've seen in like Nancy Pelosi's office. And so for a lot of us, it is this group that is fighting for consensus in the Democratic Party. But maybe you can also tell us a bit more about like how you're adjusting to the situation right now.
Yeah, so I'm involved with my local Sunrise Hub, but I am somewhat informed about what Sunrise National is doing, obviously. And what I've been seeing is just doing a lot of consciousness raising, right? Educating people about what's going on. And because right now we're in this national reckoning with police brutality and just how we view, I guess, justice as a whole as a country. So Sunrise has been doing some education around that and just kind of really emphasizing that racial justice is climate justice, is social justice, kind of like some things that have already been said here. So just really doing a lot of consciousness raising, because people have the information. Once we have the pandemic under control, people will be ready to take action, right? But you can't necessarily take a lot of action without having a lot of information and education. That's mainly what Sunrise has been doing. So kind of organizing calls like this one we're here on right now, kind of places where people can come together and talk and listen to one another and just really learn about everything that's going on. So that's kind of how Sunrise has adjusted to the pandemic.
Yeah, thank you. Then I would move on to Amanda, who is in the Philippines right now. And I think what we're seeing there is also one of these phenomena that is not only in the Philippines, but in Brazil or in the US, with those strong men who are basically like establishing this like political culture of like machismo and xenophobia and wall building and all of that. And maybe you can tell us a bit more about that and how climate justice is related there.
So currently in the Philippines right now, in 2019, actually, the Philippines was tagged as the most dangerous country for environmental defenders, according to a watchdog group, Global Witness. So right now we have 82,000 confirmed cases of the virus, which places us in the top 2 countries with the highest cases in Southeast Asia, yet less than 1% of the population is tested. But then you'd think that with those numbers, the legislators will be more focused on passing laws to address the virus, but instead, a law that aims to criminalize activism was prioritized and signed just this month. So a full militaristic approach is being enforced, which obviously isn't effective. Ever since President Duterte came into power, 113 environmental activists have been killed. And with the ATL, anti-terrorism law, in full effect, it will now be legal for the police force and national army to arrest dissenters even without a court order. Suffice to say, this pandemic is being weaponized to justify the unlawful arrests of activists and silence the government's critics.
Okay, maybe one question to you, but after that is like horrendous, and I think this is also something that we're not only seeing in the Philippines but in other countries as well. That this crisis is used to actually fight against those land defenders and to also get rid of them during this time while we're busy focusing on other issues. But what is Akbayan doing against this right now? Or how are you organizing?
Sorry?
Yeah, my question was, how are you organizing, or how are you supporting those land defenders that you just mentioned as Akbayan?
Actually, here in the Philippines, it's actually quite difficult to declare yourself as an activist outright, because there's always going to be the danger of getting red tagged or tagged as a terrorist by the government, and then that would give them the power to put you in jail or worse. So right now, the environmental activist part of the Philippines has actually taken a backseat ever since the pandemic. But I think now that we are adjusting to the new normal, it would definitely be feasible for us to incorporate it into the new adjustments.
Okay. Yeah, so we've spoken a bit about like how activism has changed now because of the pandemic. Karen also already mentioned like the systemic changes that people are asking for, the social ecological transformation. And as this panel is called a call for a global Green New Deal, like my question to you would also be like, what is the Green New Deal for you? What does it mean? And like, what does a world look like where we have actually implemented a Green New Deal? And maybe we can do like the same order that we've done from the beginning. So starting with Karen.
Thanks. So we don't have yet a position as Friends of the Earth International on whether to frame our system change agenda under the Green New Deal narrative. But in any case, we do have a proposal for a system change agenda. And we also have a proposal for just recovery policies and measures that must be implemented, urgently in order to address systemic inequalities and also the consequences of the systemic crisis and the systems of oppression, because we are in fact fighting against a system that gives priority to capital accumulation over people's rights and over the environment, but also the systems of oppression, patriarchy, racism, colonialism, class, that have structured our societies in a way that inequalities is an intrinsic feature of our societies. But not only inequality, as Amanda was mentioning, it's about the violence that is being exerted against people's rights, and is a systemic violence, systematic violence. It's not just this case here and there, but it's a violence that is deployed against those who are defending their territories, who are defending their livelihoods, and even more so against women, and women whose bodies carry the systems of systemic oppressions. So for us, this just transition requires a drastic change. And for us, some of the principles are the need to assure that we abandon neoliberalism and austerity and put in place the right policies and the right measures in order to allow for justice in all its dimensions. So this is social, environmental, gender, and economic justice, but also recognizing the ecological limits. The other principle for us is the need to strengthen real democracy and to nurture people and democracy, assuring that people's rights are realized. Both individual but also collective rights of the peoples must be realized. We also believe in the need of strengthening and enhancing internationalist solidarity and multilateral cooperation to address all the systemic crises, and the need for governments to tackle all the crises at once. We consider that all the crises are interrelated, are systemic crises, social, ecological, systemic crises, so we need to tackle them at once. And that means making sure that we are following a path that takes us closer to a system change agenda. So, for example, to make some examples, We need to make sure that we build a new economy that puts at the center the sustainability of life, and that recognizes the importance of care work. An economy that moves away from fossil fuels dependency and works towards a new energy system based on 100% renewable energy, but also on an energy system that is controlled by the peoples, publicly controlled, be it by the state, municipalities, communities, cooperatives. It means a just transition that puts at the center the rights of workers, the rights of women, of indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant and Black communities. So it's an energy transition that really has a perspective of fighting against the oppressions. It's also about securing the autonomy of women and making sure that care work becomes important in our societies, and that we recognize the importance of care work shared by societies, reversing the sexual division of labor that is exploiting women's work and bodies. We need to make sure also that we put an emphasis on the importance of public services, on the importance of cooperative systems, on the importance of local markets, of a real productive economy. And we must invest, our societies need to invest in this real productive economy that is based on justice. We need to invest in the transformation of the food system that is also causing climate crisis, but also is causing a very detrimental destruction of the livelihoods of the peoples. We need to guarantee the right to food, but also the right to land, the right to seeds, the right to water. So it's really a struggle for the rights of the peoples, for collective rights, for individual rights, but also it's a struggle to fundamentally change the systems in our societies and how we organize as societies, and to make sure that companies, transnational corporations, don't continue to accumulate more and more power, because those companies are the ones who are concentrating power, resources, and decision-making, and are really harming the planet and the people. So, for example, free trade agreements need to be reversed, because we see how governments are losing their much needed political space to have the right policies in place. We have seen how multinational companies can even take governments to international tribunals when they have good policies for the public good. So these are some of the trends we are seeing and some of the changes we are proposing. And we really need to stop the violence against women, the systemic violence against the peoples who are, building justice on the ground, who are fighting for their rights, and who are really also fighting for the environment. And that's why we are part of an internationalist movement that puts at the center the sustainability of life, but also the need to think in new ways that allow for justice and a new development path that takes us away from this colonialist, racist, patriarchal system of exploitation that is so detrimental for our rights.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really impressive. Like, you see, like, also like how much experience you have. Like, you've been fighting for this and organizing for this for years, compared to us as like the new generation that's coming up. But I think we can also like really like work with what you have like achieved already, like for us, and with the experience that you have. But I guess that Brianna and Amanda also have something to say to this, to what a Green New Deal actually means, because it's also like, for me, it's such a like vast like transformation that we have to do. I mean, it's to change how we eat, how we get around, how we live, how we work. It's a lot.
Yeah. I would say that definitely echoing everything that Karen said, and also just highlighting the point that people, when they think about the Green New Deal, right, they're thinking that, oh, everything is going to be taken away. Like, there's some quote from some like US senator talking about how like you won't be able to eat cheeseburgers after the Green New Deal because livestock will be like outlawed, and that's simply like not true. Right. And I think that sometimes when we're talking about environmentalism and climate justice, things can get so mixed up because a lot of white environmentalists in the past have kind of been at the forefront. And so a lot of some of the solutions that people have heard of in the past aren't necessarily like intersectional, or they don't really take everyone into account. So people have this like really rigid frame of what climate justice and the Green New Deal would look like. But kind of also just echoing what Karen was saying, it's about transitioning, right, from these current systems that are based upon exclusion and colonialism to newer systems and solutions that, you know, are more inclusive and include everyone. But I think that whatever the plan is for going forward, in terms of the Green New Deal, it needs to really recenter Indigenous communities, because Indigenous communities have been left out of the conversation on environmentalism for such a long time. So really just thinking about, you know, doing that. And I'm not as well versed on it, but I know that Sunrise does support something called the Red New Deal that's specifically been backed and planned and centered around Indigenous communities. So I think that's also hopefully something that can be more spoken about, is the Red New Deal, which, like I said, spearheaded by Indigenous communities. But yeah, that's kind of how I've been thinking about it recently, just really thinking about how we can recenter the most marginalized communities.
I definitely agree with what Karen and Brianna said. And the Green New Deal in the Philippine context, I'm not sure if this would actually be possible, because obviously you would like to to leave the colonialism behind and focus more on the local perspective of a of environmental conservation. But I think in the Philippine context, it's going to be a hard and strenuous journey, but not impossible. Because last year, the Philippines actually has the biggest solar farm in Southeast Asia, which is situated in Cadiz City. So this really just proves that the shift to a sustainable energy democracy is feasible when the state of the environment is in the most important consideration. And also, I think I would like to add that I think the most important thing is that we resist the fossil fuel dominated energy systems, as well as delegitimize the entire fossil fuel industry itself.
Yeah. I mean, I would totally agree also because like I think a lot of people still don't know it, or that like we've known about like the climate crisis and the effect that carbon emissions have on our climate like for so many years. I mean, it was, I think, in 77 that we had the first scientists basically proving this, and then you had the big corporations that paid think tanks or founded think tanks to actually work on climate change denialism. And I can also say, like, from my party or from my organization, we really, like, for a long time, this wasn't like in the discourse. We had green parties coming up, of course, and then you had the NGOs or social movements that, like Karen, that you're part of. But like in our parties, especially like when Brianna is mentioning like the Red New Deal, of course it has to be about social justice. And also when we're talking about big corporations, I mean, who is producing those the biggest amount of emissions? It's the wealthiest in our societies. I think it's like the wealthiest 10% are producing like 50% of all of the emissions globally, which means like if we would cut them by a large amount to basically what like the average like EU citizen produces, it would go down, I think, around like a third, which is a lot. And I think we have to really like recenter this whole discussion also on who's causing this, and go away from this whole idea of like the individual can solve this. I think every one of us can do their part, but not all of us are also able to do this. And we basically have to break every rule in the free market playbook, I would say, to fight this. And yeah, but we have also talked about like the intersections of movements, and this would be my next point. Because also Brianna is a member of two movements in a way, or trying to also connect those two. Maybe you want to start there. Can like the Green New Deal or a program that is our holistic vision of a social ecological transformation, can this be like an intersectional movement? Because what Karen was also saying is you've been talking about women as well. I mean, we've seen numbers like women are 14 times more likely to die in natural disasters, which means climate change is also sexist. And this has, of course, its roots in an economic system that is rigged. But I think we really have to keep that in mind when we're fighting for the Green New Deal, and also in environmental racism, we've spoken about that. That you have BPOC communities that are hit the hardest by the climate crisis, but are already in like very economic dire situations. So would you say that like the Green New Deal is an opportunity there to connect movements?
Yeah, definitely. So long as, like I was saying earlier, like we're really spearheading, we're really centering marginalized voices, I think that it is possible. And I think that in terms of the Green New Deal, right, it's in the US, it's like a framework, but not necessarily concrete legislation that has been laid out for sure. And I think that when we're talking about this conversation surrounding colonialism, just like the acknowledgement that pushing forward climate legislation through the US government, that's not necessarily going to solve everything, right? There needs to be a serious conversation about Indigenous sovereignty and about giving land back to Indigenous people, right? The Green New Deal, let's say there's an amazing, super comprehensive Green New Deal, all this legislation is passed by Congress, that still isn't enough if the US government is occupying, stolen land and simply not respecting Indigenous people. So I think that the Green New Deal can be a pathway to a more just future, if that makes sense. But it's not the end all be all. But it can be, it can assist with creating a just future if, like I was saying before, Indigenous people and Black people and marginalized voices are centered, definitely.
Okay, then maybe we would go on with Karen, because to you I would also have the question, like, how do you, as like Friends of the Earth, are you working with other movements as well? Or do you have like panels like this or other like events where you work closely with other social movements and NGOs?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, of course, we do work with other movements, and we are joining forces around this system change agenda and the need for a drastic and fundamental transformation of our societies, the way we organize our societies, our economy, as we said, our energy, food system, etc. And also, very importantly, how we recognize the importance of the collective management of biodiversity and the how we protect the forest in a real way, which implies that those who are dependent on forests, that is mostly indigenous peoples and communities around the world, are the best suited to really take care of the forest. But this is something that is not recognized. So it's a lot about a struggle, as we said before, against oppression, against exploitation, racism, patriarchy, also the dismantling of the working class rights, but it's also a fight to ensure that people have control over their territories, over their lands, and over the ecosystems that they have been protecting for long. So it's about defending also the traditional knowledge, the ancestral knowledge of indigenous peoples who have been taking care of nature and are the most capable of doing so. So that means the recognition of rights, and that cannot be done without joining forces and between different movements. And we have different coalitions, let's say, or convergence of movements around the world. For example, in relation to climate justice, there's a global campaign to demand climate justice, in which indigenous peoples, but also Black and Afro-descendant communities are very strong. We also have a global campaign to dismantle corporate power and to put an end to corporate impunity and build people's sovereignty. That also brings together movements from around the world. And also at the Latin American level, we have a convergence of social movements that is called Jornada Continental, that is basically a common agenda for the movements to fight for this, for system change and to fight in defense of a real democracy and against corporate power. And this is, of course, related to what Amanda was saying about the right-wing governments, extreme right-wing governments that have that are now controlling many countries around the world, like in the case of Brazil with Bolsonaro. But in general, in Latin America, the right wing is advancing, let's say, in terms of expanding, in terms of controlling governments. And this is really means that a strong attack against democracy. We have seen what's happening in Brazil, in which all the rights are at stake, in which a country where the government is basing its policies on clear denial of climate change, of the pandemic, but also denial of rights. And it's really moving forward with dismantling the rights of the population, a government that has defended coup d'etat, a government that is made up of military who have taken all the ministries. So it's really a strong attack against democracy. And that's why we need to build power, people's power. We need to join forces, and we need to make sure that we really counteract this situation in which the extreme right and the right imposes its discourse and its ideology based on hatred, on xenophobia, misogyny, racism. So that's why we are indeed very active in building alliances with other movements like Via Campesina, the World March of Women, because we believe that this is the way to build people's power, the way to really fight for system change.
Yeah. Also, when you're speaking about denialism, sometimes I don't really believe that they're denying it. They just know that it doesn't affect them in the same way that like low income and BPOC like communities will be impacted by this, and they know they can protect themselves. I think we've seen like some of the like examples of this also like when Australia was on fire, and some people, like some very rich people, had like shelters where they could go to, and others of course didn't. And I mean, this is like a marginal example, but still I think it shows like that some of us will be more affected than others. But maybe Amanda, you also want to add something to how like the Eco-Socialist Caucus is working. Are you working together with other movements in the Philippines?
Right now, the Eco-Socialist Caucus of Akbayan Youth is, as far as I know, we are working with FES to address the environmental issues that we have here in the Philippines. I kind of see a question for me, I guess. It says that since the current Philippine government, as it is, won't do any proper environmental politics ever, what can we do as an international community to support your struggle? Definitely. It's the most important. One of the most important things is to put international pressure and join the calls and start conversations surrounding environmental activism, or the entire umbrella of activism in general. You can join our calls for environmental justice and restoration because it's not as widely understood as it should be. So to support the environmental movements in the Philippines and maybe hosting online forums such as this one, writing to your legislators to speak up about it, writing to the Philippine embassy in your countries, and including the global South perspectives in the conversations like these help out a lot.
Yeah, I don't know if the others also have some ideas like concerning like international activism or how you're doing that. I mean, Karen, of course, because you're the chair of an international federation, but I think this is definitely like something that we should do more, and this is also one of the reasons why we're doing this call or this panel today. That we are saying like nature knows no borders, and we have to work cross borders to actually get where we want to go with the Green New Deal or with the systemic change, because it does affect other people. Like for example, in Germany, we were just talking about like coal plants or new coal plants being introduced. Of course, it makes a difference. Like if we do that to our neighbors in Poland, for example, and I think a lot of people do not realize this yet. But maybe you also can tell us a bit more about like, are your organizations working on an international level? Like for example, Brianna, with Sunrise, because we would be very much like interested also in doing more of these kinds of exchanges, because I think this helps us a lot. Also like skill sharing or stuff like that.
Yeah, at the moment, Sunrise is pretty US focused. And I think partially for a good reason. For example, like the US military is the largest like polluter in the entire world. So I think that there is a level of introspection that like people in the US need to have, because we hold so much just privilege and power on the global stage. But definitely, I think that people in Sunrise would be interested in doing, more transnational conversation and just doing more transnational advocacy, because it is really important, right? Because this is everyone's world. And I think that on the term, just I like how you phrase it, conversation across borders, because I think for me, it's kind of like the gears are moving in my head, just thinking about like the idea of borders and how they are kind of like a colonial tool for oppression. And I think that elevating this conversation to a more global scale can also kind of elevate a conversation about climate justice and colonialism, and just how, I guess, privilege operates on a global scale when we're talking about climate change and climate justice.
Okay, do the others want to add something to it, to like the international scale of this?
Yeah, I think we have all our movements have a long tradition of fighting against oppression, and also against, for example, neoliberalism, a struggle that we have been taking for many years, and neoliberal corporate-led globalization. There has been a very strong movement around the world fighting against it. And I think today we see that this, once again, the time to really make sure that we put an end to neoliberal policies and the very doctrine of neoliberalism, as it has proved that it doesn't care people. It cannot take care of people, cannot take care of health, cannot take care of the environment. On the contrary, it's really destroying our environment. Is leading to a profound rupture between our societies and the environment, and further expansion of capital accumulation throughout the planet. So this can only be tackled internationally. It's impossible to fight against neoliberalism only in one country, or even against these right-wing forces. It's very difficult, like Amanda was saying, to do it in your own country. So we need to build international solidarity. And that's something, for example, when we talk about the climate struggle, that is something that has been quite strong, is how you connect communities in the South who are being attacked or are being impacted by certain companies, like Shell, that Royal Dutch company in Nigeria, or Total, the French company in Uganda, who are really violating the rights of the peoples, are really destroying the environment, and how we can join forces to campaign against those companies in their home countries, for example. Or also how we campaign together, different movements, to make sure that we fight for a future without patriarchy, a future in which women's rights are realized, women's autonomy is realized, and where we make sure that the care work is shared by societies. We also need to fight for a new role for the state, and this is something that we also need to work together internationally, because we are calling for a stronger role of the state, but not just any kind of state. We are calling for a role of the state that is centered around people's rights, and a role of the state that really is not about organizing society for capital accumulation, but is really organizing society to realize the sustainability of life, to make possible the fulfillment of human needs. So there are many of these struggles that we are taking forward that cannot happen at the national level only, although it is very important to have the grassroots, also the social movements on the ground struggling for these collective rights, struggling for the defense of nature and the environment, but we also need to join forces internationally to become stronger. And this is something that has, as I said, a long tradition and has proven to be very powerful. When we see racism in the US, it's not something that is only happening in the US, of course. Communities are rising up, but we need to rise up everywhere in the world against racism. And that's something, for example, that has happened recently, how different communities and different movements around the world has joined forces to really once again denounce and fight against racism. And the same for the feminist movement, and joining forces with other movements. So this is a struggle that demands this cooperation and this international solidarity among movements, but also going through the borders and making sure that the borders don't become even stronger, because that's one of the main risks and the threats we are facing, is that borders are becoming stronger and stronger, and we see how our rights and the rights of migrants, for example, are being totally dismantled and horribly attacked because of these rising borders. And also the persecution of social movements. What Amanda was talking about the Philippines and what we have seen in the US is a reality in many of our countries where right-wing governments came to power, is a strong persecution of the social movements with campaigns trying to delegitimize them, campaigns to try to dismantle those movements and so on. So this is something that also requires strong solidarity internationally.
Yeah, no, I would totally agree with you on this. I see we have another question, I think. No, it's just a comment, basically agreeing with what we're saying. What I wanted to say is when we've been talking about like the intersections and also internationalism, I mean, one of the conflicts that I have been seeing, and I think this is will also be triggered by this crisis again, is still like the conflict between the labor movement and the environmental movement when it comes to fighting big corporations, especially when we see like communities or societies where people are basically one paycheck from poverty away, which means I think transforming like the work sector or our work life is one of the major things where we have to still do a lot of thinking on how do we frame this in the right way. I mean, one of the things that we're discussing right now, I think on a European level, is also like working time reduction, which is a very concrete thing, but I think one of the things where we could intersect movements, basically. So you have the environmental movements, you have kind of this degrowth thought in there, but also like the feminist movement, what Karen is saying with care work, because also like what we're seeing with this pandemic is that we had the standing armies, and there we go back to what Brianna said with the military. we have those standing armies, but what we were missing were basically standing armies of healthcare workers and people in green jobs, in like low carbon work and very valuable work at the same time, that we're not spending enough money on the investment in those. And I think this is a big issue. How we can solve this, I guess we still have to find out. But I don't know if you want to comment on any of this when it comes to like the conflict labor and environmentalism. How you're framing that in your organization?
Yeah. Oh wait, sorry, were you going to Amanda? I don't know if she spoke on the last question.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So I think the thing about neoliberal state apparatuses, they are more concerned with profit over everything else, but at what cost? The Asia Pacific has both the world's biggest contributors to carbon emissions and also the countries that are most affected by the effects of global warming. So my organization, Akbayan Youth, is active in the youth strike for climate in the Philippines, and through the International Union of Socialist Youth, where we did a climate justice conference with the Asia Pacific Youth last year. And I think the first step to achieving an ideal society wherein all sectors are committed to environmental rehabilitation is the urgency of the climate emergency must first be realized. Only then can we reconfigure the patterns to include abundant, accessible, and sustainable alternatives from the devastation of capitalism.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah, I will say in terms of like labor and environmentalism, and one thing Sunrise does is just emphasize that we're not taking people's jobs away. The goal is to, you know, save our future and create millions of good jobs in the process. Because while we're going to have a reduced need for people working in the fossil fuel industry, we're going to need tons of people working in the renewables industry. And all we have to do is just train them, you know, to transition those skills. There was, I think it was, I can't remember who said it, but one person used the example is that we're going to need people working in the fossil fuel industry to kind of help us, you know, dismantle it in a way, or help reduce the scale of it. So for example, like taking down pipelines, right? We're going to need people to be doing that work, because since the fossil fuel industry is so ingrained within our society, we're going to need people working in that industry to help, you know, reduce the scale. So there's going to be lots of jobs for people, right? It doesn't mean we're taking people's jobs away.
Yeah, I agree. And also because I think the just transition proposal, in fact, comes from indigenous peoples and trade unions working together for the sustainability of life. So when we realize that the same system that is destroying the planet, destroying the climate, is the same system that is taking away the rights of the workers and the rights of communities, then we realize that we need to stay together. And that's the reality for many trade unions around the world. In fact, in our case, in Latin America, we work closely with the Trade Union Confederation of the Americas, because they are conscious of the need for a just transition, and they are working, in fact, towards a just transition, and have a proposal for a development platform that is very much in line with the calls for sustainability and justice. So we are integrating more and more our agendas, and of course, more needs to be done, but it's about all the movements really putting their strengths together and joining forces. And so we don't see the workers, the unions as an adversary or as an enemy. On the contrary, we think we are part of the same struggle. But of course, it depends a lot on how we see this crisis from a class perspective, from an anti-racist perspective, from anti-patriarchal perspective, anti-colonialist perspective. And there are differences within the movements in that regard, of course, we all know. But we do believe in joining forces, and we believe that we have a common cause, let's say, with trade unions, as we do with the other movements we have mentioned before. And in fact, many those workers who are suffering because of this exploitative system, also their communities are suffering, because we know that the working class is also very much affected by the detrimental policies and the impacts of this energy system that is so unfair, that it does not allow for access to energy for all, because it's really not a right. Energy is not considered a right, but a commodity. It's more privately controlled and owned. So we have a common struggle ahead of us to defend the right to energy, to defend the right to food, to defend the right to our livelihoods, to defend our rights in general, collective rights, and to make sure that we have more democratic control over the systems for energy production, for food production, our economy, and so on. So it's really a fight for people's rights and for the environment at the same time, we think.
And maybe, as we don't have any questions from the viewers anymore, to the last question, like, would you say that this crisis is then, like this pandemic, as another one of these crises that our generation has to go through, is an opportunity to actually make the case for the systemic transition or transformation? Don't know who wants to start.
Can you say that one more time? I think I missed the last half of the question.
Like, would you agree that this crisis that we're going through right now with the pandemic is then an opportunity to make the case for a systemic transformation?
I guess I could go first. I would say definitely, just because we're realizing due to the pandemic how so many things in our current society aren't working, right? There shouldn't be people getting evicted during a pandemic. Well, there shouldn't be people getting evicted, period, but especially not during a pandemic. That's just one example, but just really seeing this pandemic has definitely exposed kind of like the inefficiencies of capitalism and just our current system. And it has definitely, I've seen personally, push a lot of people to accept the fact that we need to do something different.
Okay, maybe Karen wants to comment on this.
Yeah, definitely. I think we are clear, and it's more clear than ever, that we need to change a current system. And we need to, for example, change the food system in a way that allows for healthy food to be produced for the working class, for the peoples, the peasants, the indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant of land communities, to control land, seeds, and water in order to be able to continue producing food, because we know that those who produce food are in fact these peoples, these communities, and not the agro-industrial system, for example. So we really know that the pandemic has its roots in the current system. We cannot go back to what was considered normal before the crisis, because that state of affairs, that status quo, was in fact at the origin of the pandemic, but also of the other systemic crises. So the need for change is clear. The issue is how we make sure that the changes that are going to take place are based and founded on justice. And as we said before, justice in all its dimensions, and people's sovereignty and people's power, because we do run the risk that the system is going to become more brutal and even more exclusive, and even more detrimental and provoking even more damage. So we know that is something that needs to be changed. We also realize the need for justice, but it's a difficult struggle. It's not something that is going to be easy. But we do believe in the in the victory we can have is we join forces, and if we really depart from everything we have been able to accumulate in terms of knowledge, in terms of social accumulation, in terms of building stronger ties at the community level among different movements and so on. So we need to use our power, the one that is already there, and our knowledge and our experience in order to fight for the change that we need.
I would like to echo what Brianna said, that the pandemic definitely exposed the systems which are not working, and it also emphasizes the need for ecological and social well-being. I think um, it's from the perspective of a youth activist, the passage of a legislation that aims to fiercely enforce measures for environmental conservation will definitely be a cause for celebration, especially during now that we are adjusting to what we call the new normal. So I guess I would like to envision a world where, especially in the Philippine archipelago, where um, it's going to revolve around energy democracy, where it will enable the acquisition of renewable sources, which are abundant and widely accessible, which will in turn offer long-term stability and widespread local adoption.
Thank you. And I would totally agree, because I think also like one of the things that this crisis brought with it, even though there has been a lot of pain and suffering, of course, of those people affected, but it made us like slow down in a way that I think a lot of people felt things, because they realized like how interconnected they are with other people at the same time. When it comes to like, where do I get my food and who has touched my food before I have, like make those relationships very like transparent and made us think about them. And I think this is also one of the reasons why we've seen like the big uprisings in the US with Black Lives Matters, that you just like realize that those like racist atrocities have happened, and that you have to like unite and fight against them, and that there's an intersection with other inequalities that we're facing. So I guess this has to be the opportunity, and we have to have the plan as progressives, or some of us socialists, or eco-socialists, to have the plan and to move forward, and to adapt to this new normal and make it into a new system that's more just and equal for all of us, and especially for those who have been suffering, for like marginalized groups who have been suffering for hundreds of years because of oppression. But I think what we're taking from this discussion at the same time is that what we need is like movement building, is engaged citizenship, is more international solidarity, or organizing with labor together. And at the same time, it makes me very hopeful to see that we're like this panel of women fighting for this, when women at the same time are those groups that are affected the most. And I think this is also one of the things that we still have to work on, is that putting women like in the forefront, or in the positions of power, to actually decide what's happening with our climate and with our society, because we still don't see that. When I see numbers from particularly like the IPCC council, where you have like, I think 20% only like women sitting there who are making the decisions, and this is just like, we cannot tolerate this, and we have to work on that. When we at the same time have like Greta and so many others fighting, like young girls fighting on the streets at the climate strikes. So this is our responsibility, I think, for the future, to work on this. So thank you for joining us for this talk, and I hope we will stay in touch. And this was it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.